One man thinks he's pretty good and the other man knows that he's not. And really, this is a cautionary tale. And Jesus tells us really clearly who it is directed at. Verse 9, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. And so the big question, the big challenge for us this morning, I think, is, are you someone who this parable is being addressed to? Am I someone who this parable is being addressed to? And to help us answer that question, I've got a few questions for you to consider this morning. Is this parable something that's being addressed to you? Is it something being addressed to me? A few questions to help us work that out. And I gleaned these from a guy by the name of James Merritt. First question is, you don't have to answer these out loud, by the way, just quietly inside your own head. But do you look at people who don't go to church, at least as regularly as you? Do you look at people who don't go to church and think you're slightly better than them because you do? If your answer to that question is yes, then this parable is for you. Number two, my second question is, do you look at people with a substance abuse problem? Maybe we walked past some of them this morning as you came into church, but do you ever look at people with a substance abuse problem and think that you're a bit better than them because you don't have that same problem? If you do, then this parable is for you. Do you ever look at anyone who maybe has had a relationship breakdown? Maybe their relationship has failed. Maybe they're divorced. Do you ever look at someone like that and think, well, I feel a bit better than them because your relationship seems healthy and is going well and has lasted a long time? If you do, then this parable is for you. Another question is, maybe do you ever look at people whose kids haven't turned out so well? Maybe people that you've journeyed through life with, maybe their kids haven't turned out particularly well, they've made bad choices, they've done silly things. Do you ever look at those people and think you're a bit better than them because your kids have actually turned out pretty well? If you do, if you have, then this parable is for you. And the last question is this: do you ever look down your nose at anyone for any reason? If you do, then this parable is for you. And I have to say, this parable is definitely for me. This parable is for me. If I'm honest, I have to own up to the fact that I actually judge people all the time. I judge people all the time. I have little thoughts in my head about maybe might be simple things like what someone's wearing, maybe the way they're behaving over in the mall, maybe for the way a relationship is broken down, whatever it might be, maybe for the way just someone looks, maybe for what they've got in their shopping basket. There's a whole range of reasons that I might judge someone for and think I'm a bit better than them because of what they're doing that I'm not. And I don't necessarily verbalise those thoughts, but they're definitely in here. They definitely happen. Somehow I often look at people and think that I'm better than them or maybe more impressive than they are. Well, today in our parable, in our reading from Luke chapter 19, we learn what God finds impressive and what God doesn't. We learn what impresses God and what doesn't impress God. So that's what I want to look at this morning. Let's start with what does not impress God, which brings us to the Pharisee. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get. Now, it's easy to look at this Pharisee with our modern eyes and to think he's a bit of a jerk, he's a bit of a pompous git, whatever you might think. It's easy to look at him and think, I'm not like that. But we need to understand that for most people at that time, the Pharisees were the good guys. The Pharisees were regarded as very holy, very religious, good people. They were Jewish people who did everything they could to live a holy life, to follow all the religious rules. The Pharisees dotted every I and crossed every religious T that they could. They were good people. If you ask the average punter, who are the good people in our community, they would say, well, the Pharisees. Have you seen the rules those guys stick to? to impress God, to do the right thing by God. They're godly people. They were incredibly committed religious people, and they were revered in the community because of it. Maybe a bit like ministers used to be when you were younger, but times 10. People looked at them and thought, now that's a holy person. And so this Pharisee in our story, he's obviously pretty arrogant, but he strides into the middle of the temple because that's where he belongs. Strides into the middle of the temple, and he makes clear how good he is. Starting with the fact that he fasts twice a week, which is actually quite impressive because at that time, Jews were only required to fast once a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement. So this guy's fasting twice a week, so 103 times more than he needs to. That's actually pretty impressive. That's good when it comes to religious rules and religious living. And then we get to the money part. This Pharisee gives a tenth of everything he gets. We call that tithing. So giving money to the temple in that context, or in our context, we tithe to the church, to the work of God in the community. And he's a regular tither, and he probably, tithes a good amount. So that's another tick in the good guy column. And please don't mishear me. There's actually nothing wrong with fasting and praying and giving money to the work of the church and what God is doing in the local community. There's nothing wrong with good theology, with understanding our scripture. Those things are all good things. But the Pharisee in our reading this morning is making the same mistake that a lot of people make today. He thinks that he can somehow earn brownie points, earn good standing, earn favour with God by being good, by doing the right thing. He thinks he can earn God's favour through what he does, and we need to be careful not to make the same mistake. What might that look like for us? Well, part of it, I think, is trusting in anything, whether that's church membership, regular church attendance, baptism, the theology we have, the good works that we do. And again, none of those things in and of themselves are bad, but if we are trusting in those and not Jesus to make us right with God, then we're making a mistake. We're going down a wrong path. If we're trusting anything other than Jesus, then we're going down the wrong track. Because here's the thing about that. To trust any of those other things, whether it's our church attendance, our fine upstanding moral behaviour, our tithing, our baptism, to trust any of those things is in some ways to actually make it about us, to make it about you. That was the Pharisee's problem. He was so focused on himself and how good he was and the good things he was doing that he actually lost focus on God. C.S. Lewis, the famous author and Christian thinker, so obviously wrote the Narnia series and books like Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, well-known Christian thinker, he said this. He said, a proud man, or proud person, he was a product of his time, but a proud person is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you can't see something that's above you. As long as you're looking down, you can't see something that's above you. The Pharisee was deluded. He was deluded and he didn't know it. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people. Thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. But here's the thing. Here's the irony of that statement. He is actually exactly like other people. He's just like everyone else. He just hasn't realised it. In God's eyes, he is just like everyone else. Paul, a leader and a teacher in the early church, the Apostle Paul, in Romans 3 verse 23, famous verse, Paul said, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Not a few, not some, all. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so, biblically speaking, no matter where we stand in society or church, no matter what our standing is, all have missed the mark. All. When it comes to living the way God created us to live, we've all missed the mark. And I've said before, the Greek word for sin in the New Testament is hamartia, which literally means to miss the mark, to miss the mark when it comes to living the way God created us to live. And when we miss the mark, when we don't live the way God created us to live, it damages the people around us, it damages us, damages God's good creation, and it damages our relationship with God. It creates a distance between us and God when we don't live the way we were created to live. All have missed the mark. We've all missed the mark, and we're kidding ourselves if we think otherwise. I often say that we've all missed the mark, we all do the wrong thing, but some of us are better at hiding it than others. For some people it's more obvious what their problems are or what the wrong things they're doing are, but some of us are just better at hiding it than others. We're all sinners. Which brings us to the tax collector, a man who knew who he was. The tax collector knew who he was. He knew he was no good. He knew he'd missed the mark, and so did everyone else. It came out a little bit in that video, but tax collectors were hated. People did not like tax collectors, and I'm sure you're all aware that at the time, Jewish land was being occupied by the Romans. The Romans were cruel occupiers. They treated people badly. They taxed a lot of their money and their food, so they lived poorly. And the Romans were hated because of that. But the people they got to collect the tax were Jewish people. Jewish people who were prepared to work for the occupiers. And so they were regarded as traitors. People hated them. And with good reason, because often the tax collectors would collect more than they had to line their own pockets. And so they were hated, and they often were dodgy people. They were disliked for a reason. And so in all likelihood, this tax collector was disliked for a reason. And yet amazingly, and you need to understand, really offensively, Jesus makes him the hero of the story. It would have been so offensive to the people hearing that it was the tax collector, not the Pharisee, that was the hero of the story, the one who goes home justified before God. It would have been offensive, and we miss the offence that would have called because culturally we don't understand it. He is the one, the tax collector is the one who impresses God. And so what was it that impressed God? Well, he was as humble as the Pharisee was proud. He was as humble as the Pharisee was proud. He goes to the edge of the temple. The Pharisee goes to the middle. The tax collector looks down. The Pharisee walks in with his chin tilted up because he's a proud man. He deserves what he gets, and he thinks he's getting good things. The tax collector beats his breast. It's almost as though he's physically demonstrating the fact that he has a filthy heart, that his heart is dirty, it's unclean, he's done the wrong thing and he knows it. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's what the tax collector says. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. He is under no illusions as to where he stands. But amazingly, God hears his prayer. He's the one who goes home okay in God's eyes. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the path to God is paved with humility. From the outside looking in, you would think that it's the Pharisee who is clearly the one closer to the heart of God. That would seem obvious. But in reality, it's the tax collector. Psalm 34 verse 18 tells us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Jesus said, "I've come to preach good news to the poor." It's the broken, it's the crushed who understand who they are and where they stand and their need of God. Good news to the poor. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The tax collector acknowledges his brokenness before God. He says, I'm sorry. I've missed the mark. Will you forgive me? Will you cover for me? This is an amazing story. It's a scandalous story, and it would have been so offensive to the people who heard it. If you'd taken a vote, as Jesus stood there and told this story, if you'd taken a vote with the people standing around listening and said, out of these two people, Who is it that God accepts? Who is it that God is pleased with? It would have been unanimous. They would have all said the Pharisee. But there's only one vote that counts, and that's God's. And the good news is, we're being reminded this morning, is if we admit to God, if we recognise who we are and where we stand before God, if we recognise and acknowledge that we've missed the mark, we haven't lived the way God called us to live, and that's been bad for us and the people around us and our relationship with God. If we recognise that, then God is only too willing to offer mercy and forgiveness. That's good news. It's good news for all of us. And so the big question, I think, from the reading this morning is, are we prepared to face up to who we really are? Are we prepared to face up to who we really are? I read a story this week about a man who used to play in the Emperor's Orchestra in China, and he played the flute. Thing was, though, he couldn't actually play the flute. He used to just pretend. He mimed. I actually did that once. I used to play the French, well, I kind of used to play the French horn when I was going through primary school and high school, and I once mimed my way around South Australia on a school concert tour because I couldn't actually play the instrument, but I got away with it. But this guy didn't get away with it. He mimed his way. Whenever there was a concert, he'd sit there with his flute and he'd play away, and he drew a wage, and he had quite a good life, and it was all going swimmingly until they were told that they all had to perform a solo for the Emperor. And he panicked because he couldn't actually play the flute. So he thought, what am I going to do? So on the day the solo came, he said, I'm sick, I can't play, I don't feel very well. But the Emperor's physician was having none of it, and he said, no, you're fine, you need to go and play. And so the man thought, I can't play, and so he went and drank some poison and fell into a permanent sleep, let's just put it that way. But then the explanation for his death was that he refused to face the music. That was the explanation given for his death. He refused to face the music. That's where we actually get the saying from, it's time to face the music, or he refused to face the music. That's the origin of that saying. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And so the way to impress God, we're being reminded this morning, is to simply, maybe easier said than done, but the way to impress God is to actually face the music, to acknowledge where we are, to ask for forgiveness, and to start walking a different path, a path that's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not just going to be onwards and upwards the whole way, at least if you're anything like me, but we start heading in the right direction, walking with Jesus and towards God. That's the call this morning, to face the music, to acknowledge who we are, but to know that we're acknowledging that to a loving God, a loving Father who wants the best for us and is willing to forgive and say, yep, that's okay, let's start moving in the right direction. Just going to leave a bit of silence now for you to hear what God might be saying to you by God's Spirit, and then I'll pray. So just some silence.